You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic.
I'm Matt Gerasimowicz, PhD candidate at Northwestern University, studying Russian literature and film.
And I'm Cameron Lalana, a literature enthusiast and a guy working in media.
This right here is the podcast for people who are trying to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture. Every episode, we're going to be bringing you the background and analysis you'll need to know to understand these works.
If you're interested in supporting us, you can head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. All right, Matt, what I'd say are we getting into this week, but really, what are we finishing up this week?
We are finally, after inching along towards it for weeks, we're finishing up Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita. As I said to Cameron before the episode, after witnessing a number of Reddit threads complaining about the Russian names in lots of Russian books,
Right?
How dare they? I decided we could call him Mikey Bulgogi this week, and that would be sufficient.
Yeah. Old Mikey Bulgogi.
Oh, Mikey Bulgogi. He notoriously hated when people called him that. But well.
Yes, recovering. It was 26 through the epilogue of Miguel Bulgogi's masterpiece, Master and Margarita. I was trying to think of a more American way
that we will desecrate shortly.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. We've been here for a little while. We've been with one of the greats of Soviet literature for over a month now. Is there anything before we talk about the wrapping up the story, finally getting to Master and Margarita, the Master and Margarita having their day in the sun? Anything you want to address before we get into it?
So I do actually, because I always, before I do these episodes, a lot of times I'll go online and I will see, especially for the more popular ones, what people are struggling with, and I'll try to pick out what are some of the questions that I see across a lot of different, threads or forums or wherever I can find what minuscule discussion exists online for Russian literature.
Right.
And for this one, there's just like a lot of threads of people being like, I don't get it. And I actually think that is a fair response to this book.
Yeah.
I don't think any of us really get it. And if you've gotten to the end and you're just waiting for us to unlock this and unveil Mikey Bulgogi's kingdom to you and show you, this one master key that's going to allow you to understand it, that's not going to be it, I don't think. And I feel like all of the articles that have read have just so desperately wanted to do that, and I really haven't seen any that are that convincing.
Yeah. I think almost you should think about this in the same way that if you happen to listen to our episode on Solaris, you should approach it much in the same way that if you walk away confused, but with a lot of thoughts, that's a good place to be. But if you walk away feeling like, I think I got that, you should perhaps reconsider the position that you've come out on and maybe take a moment to re-examine that and what led you there.
Yeah, but okay, opposite from Solaris, I think it should still be funny,
right?
Probably, but in like a real way, not in like an I know a lot about Tarkovsky, and so I think this is funny kind of way. Right. Also, I have a really sick and twisted sense of humor, so I think making my friends watch this is funny kind of way. That's different. That's completely different, and that to me is just the main takeaway. That's it. It's genuinely funny.
Have a good time. I think in a lot of ways there is this. I don't know if you've ever listened to the Mountain Goats, but one of the most popular albums of the Mountain Goats is All Hail West Texas, and I think it's the opening song is the best ever death metal band from Denton, and the song ends on, after this whole song, the lead singer yelling "Hail Satan" for like a good minute, which is an odd move for a Catholic, you might think, but as he described in a podcast, it kind of, that moment came to him as sort of a moment of just a method of transgression, right? And a method of all the stress in the song, all of the storytelling here is released in this moment of transgression. And there's this moment of just like you step over the line and suddenly you feel like, I'm here, I've done it. And you do it again and again. I kind of feel like that's what, at least when I'm reading this, that's what I read in a lot of this, is that there's the beauty and the glory and that stress relief of transgression in Master and Margarita in all parts, especially towards the ending here.
I'm not even really going to step into the level of Mountain Goats knowledge that you have right now. I'm going to let that stand.
Sure. Not going to step into my what was it, the 4 or 5 months my girlfriend and I spent just like listening to every album and listening to all the podcasts he went on to study for our show. That's not uninviting conversation.
It's fortunate for me that this podcast is about the one thing, the one small thing that I know a lot about. But it just appears there are so many things that you know so much about. It's just that the podcast isn't about that, but it is amazing every time when you know these things to me.
Yeah, well, one day, I think when we transition to our secondary podcast, which is just going to be the various rabbit holes that we could go down, well, we'll get more into those. But
speaking of people who are going down rabbit holes, that's a perfectly fine segue into the end of this book.
I think so. I think that's a great way to start. So we left off last time with the master finally being returned to Margarita, the liberation of the master, and let's come back to the procurator in chapter 26 with how the procurator tried to save Judas of Kerioth. As you may recall, the procurator, this is shortly after Yeshua Ha-Nozri's execution, and Pilate brings the head of his secret police in and says, hey, I have some information that Judas of Kerioth, the man who turned in that information that led to Yeshua's death, that he's going to be killed tonight. And the head of the secret police, Ephraimius, is like, I haven't heard anything about that. And Pilate's like, you should look into it. He says, okay, sure. And what ends up happening is that night, as Judas is walking the streets, a woman kind of approaches him and says, hey, meet me out in this, near in these gardens, and these, I believe it's an olive vineyard near Gethsemane. Gethsemane is not far from where, of course, Yeshua was crucified. And he goes there, entranced by this woman, someone he seems to know fairly well. And while he's there, he is stabbed to death. And as it turns out, is the murderer is none other but our very own procurator, Pontius Pilate. The next day, Pilate gives a light rebuking to Ephraimius for not preventing Judas's death. But of course, as you can tell by the conversation, through their conversation about how are we going to investigate this murder, it's really setting up the story of what's our story for why this murder wasn't solved. And Ephraimius tells him more about how the burial of these three criminals, Yeshua Ha-Nozri and the two others, went, and notes that he found the body of Yeshua in the possession of Levi Matvei, and the procurator says, "Now, of course, I should have guessed." And Matvei kind of Ephraimius has brought Matvei to this palace, and they have a conversation which basically leads into Pilate saying, "Hey, come work for me," and revealing that he killed Judas, which is what leads Levi Matvei, who had up to that point been intending himself to kill Judas, to sort of his service. And that whereas where we leave off at the procurator for now. From there, we jump back into Margarita's perspective, and at this point we kind of have this sort of cavalcade of comedy as the investigators are trying to figure out what has happened the other night. Why are all these people under this, what they believe is mass hypnosis? Why are all these people disappearing? And we have this sort of comedy of errors as they, as in the ensuing days, things return to normal. But suddenly the investigators trying to tie up loose ends find Volan's retinue from time to time, and it always leads to chaos. Including one point when they get into a shootout with Behemoth, which leads to no one at all being hurt.
That is hands down the best scene of the entire book.
Yeah. I think the playing straight of them being in a shootout before they all realize that no one's hurting anyone.
That is so funny to me.
So as Behemoth's making escape, he also sets the apartment on fire, and from there, Behemoth and Koroviev are kind of tranced around the city, making one last pass at causing chaos, setting on fire a hard currency store, eventually setting Griboyedov's on fire before returning to the devil, and the devil being like, oh, interesting. I guess they're going to have to rebuild, them going through their usual antics before, as they are waiting for, he listening to the story, Levi Matvei shows up and says, look, I've got a message from the big man upstairs. Not the big man, from our friend Yeshua Ha-Nozri, whatever name Yeshua is going by now. And he says that you should take the Master and Margarita into peace. And the devil's kind of like, well, haven't they earned your place? Why don't they go with you? And Matvei says, look, they've earned peace, not light. So they go with you. From there, as Azello goes and fetches Master and Margarita, they're off in their own little apartment now, which was formerly Alois, someone who is then vacated by the devil, but formerly the masters, as they're having this quiet moment as Azello appears and gives them a bottle of wine to celebrate, which ends up poisoning both of them before he sort of unpoisons both of them. They get up from this sort of death and they go with him back to the devil, goes to Sparrow Hills, which is, if you're not familiar with the Sparrow Hill, it's sort of this, I don't know if it's the main building of Moscow State University or if it's the whole campus of Moscow State University is up there, but it's like a hill that overlooks Moscow, so you can see most of the city from up there. And they go take one last look at the city before they fly off into their eternal refuge. And as they fly into the night away from Moscow, which, as a small note, the Moscow kind of fades into the distance in very similar terms to how we're introduced to Jerusalem the first time. And the true versions, the true aspects of Volan's retinue are finally revealed as they fly away and as they stare mournfully up into the moon before the Master and Margarita are sent to their eternal peaceful home in some kind of unknown plane. Also, we delve briefly into Ivan Bezdomny, who just goes by Ivanushka. They say goodbye. They also stop in to say goodbye to him. He is now completely calm. All this sort of earlier mania of the initial arrival of the devil has left him, and he now is called. The master refers to him as his disciple, which is going to be, at least I think, important later. And they go to so Master and Margarita go to their eternal home, and in the epilogue, the investigators determine that all these weird occurrences actually have a completely rational explanation, and everyone goes back to their normal life, more or less. Some with the psychological scars leave behind their jobs, go to new jobs, retire early, whatever, with the exception of Ivan, who every year, once a year, around the same time that the Devil's Ball had happened, goes to Patriarch's Ponds to stare at the moon, and he feels drawn in some way to it. And although he knows rationally that he was subject to a sense of to mass hypnosis as everyone else was, he feels in some way that is not true. And that is where we leave Master and Margarita.
He also turns into a werewolf on the full moon.
Right.
And it's a really weird sort of... That's actually the sequel.
Yeah, well, yeah, much in the same way that the Master beseeches Ivan to write the sequel to Pilot's story, Ivan also takes control of this narrative and writes his own story in which he becomes a werewolf haunting not only Moscow, but also London and all these other... It becomes a whole franchise.
And then he's in the Thriller music video,
Yeah.
and it is just... It goes really off the rails from there.
Yeah, he sells out at a certain point. I mean, his artistic project
He really goes corporate. That's what I can't forgive with him.
Yeah, that's the problem. I mean...
That's the problem.
I mean, I get it. After the Soviet Union falls, it's a difficult time for everyone. But, I mean, there's a line between survival and really just, I mean,
shouldn't an artist have a limit? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's what really we're recovering in this episode. Just where is the...
Where is the line as an artist?
Yeah.
I wouldn't know. I don't produce anything useful. I make a podcast, so...
So you're going to have to tell us if any of you happen to be artists. We do have some quite artistic listeners out there. Anyway, so where do you want to start with this ending? Is there anything you want to address first?
First, I actually wouldn't mind taking a quick break and being back in just a second.
Sure, absolutely.
A quick second, though.
Just an incredibly brief second.
And if you're listening on like Spotify, don't hit that 30-second fast forward button. I'm going to make this purposely in odd increments so that you'll miss whatever I'm talking about next.
Yeah, and if you skip it, then you won't know who this episode is brought to you by, and it's brought to you by you, my listeners.
Whoa.
I know, wild.
Oh.
You didn't expect that one. You can support independent podcasting by heading to our website, slavicalitpod.com. You'll get access to the notes we used to make this episode, including links to all of our secondary sources mentioned. Oh, we got some good ones this episode.
We do. We have good ones every episode, but, this one too. If you want to support the show, but you don't want to spend any... Oh, man, I didn't think of my ad-lib for this part. If you want to support the show, but you don't want to spend any of your hard-earned, I don't know, artistic labor vouchers.
Sure, yeah.
You can join our email list for free at slavicalitpod.com, or you can leave us a nice review wherever you get your podcasts. Those are my favorite above everything else to see. I do like labor vouchers, but
yeah,
reviews are nice too.
Either or, if you want to give us both, that's great. Questions, comments, or maybe you want to appear on our Office Hours podcasts, drop us a line. You can reach our voicemail at 209-800-3944, or you can also email us a voice recording or text question at slaviclitpod@gmail.com. or bring your question onto the podcast and do our best to address it.
All right, back to the hill overlooking Moscow.
Right, back to Sparrow Hills. Or is it Sparrow's Hill or Sparrow Hills? Hills or okay, sorry, it's Sparrow Hills, plural. Beautiful place. Also, as a side point,
What do you mean beautiful place? What have you been looking there?
What we've been there?
Have we?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. Well,
we took an incredibly dangerous picture where there's at the top of the hill there's like a big, I think, marble or granite railing, and if you look over the railing, there's a steep drop onto like 100-foot drop behind it.
I do remember.
Yeah, and then
okay.
I didn't know that, so I laid on I got on top of the railing, laid on it, and took like pay me like one of your French girls kind of photo, and then I looked back and was like, if I fell, I think I'd actually die.
yeah, you would have. And there would have not been much for you after that, considering you've heard the story probably of Cameron desecrating the Holy Spring.
Yeah, it would. Well, as my homestay mother opined, desecrating the Holy Spring might have actually saved me. It might have been a sort of impromptu baptism. I was already baptized as a child. I don't think you can do it a second time, but I guess that depends on your congregation. I don't know, whatever form of Christianity your baptism is coming from.
Tends to depend on whether it was Trinitarian or not. But
right,
I digress.
We'll come back to the Trinitarian doctrines later on.
Yeah. Usually baptism is not done by sticking one foot in a holy spring, but hey, you could be.
Baptism at the Protestant church I grew up in was done in a hot tub on stage. So I think.
All right. No doubt. Cameron was in the Righteous Gemstones before it was cool.
Anyhow, okay, let's talk about Master and Margarita. So this, like every other part, is a pretty packed part. I mean, that was a very when I'm skipping over like the chaos still being caused in Moscow. There's still a lot of chaos being caused in Moscow, especially with Korovyov and Behemoth's final send off. Also, as to Matt's point earlier, this remains an incredibly funny part. And if you are going through this book, if you're ever wondering, are you in the right translation or not? It's for you that Matt. What the most important thing, I think, is whether or not you're having a good time reading this. It should be very funny because it is very funny.
I can weigh in a little too, because the first time I read this book, I really liked it a lot. And I don't remember what translation I was using. I was reading it for class, and I had one I thought was funny. I'm reading. Let me double check to make sure that is what I'm actually reading this time. Yeah, I am reading the Pierre and Volokonsky one, which is by far the prettiest looking cover of them all. This is out of all the books that I own, this is one that I consistently get compliments on the cover.
Right.
The text sucks. It is not funny at all. It is like abhorrent what they've done with some of the passages. I don't even need to look at the original to know that it is butchered because of the fact that it is just not funny.
Right.
At all. So on this read through, it hasn't been as enjoyable for me. I mean, I know my experience the first time was much better than this time, just purely based on the translation. And that's someone who reads a lot of Russian Slavic literature, understands where the humor should be coming through. And it totally didn't. So if like Cameron said, if you're thinking maybe, doesn't seem that funny to me, well, maybe double check a different translation. It might make it a little bit better.
I remember at one point I was trying to grab a quote from Master and Margarita put somewhere, and I think I had a Pierre and Volokonsky copy, and I went to go grab the part where the cat's like, oh no, this isn't vodka, it's pure alcohol. And I read that and I was like, I remember this being funnier, so I had to go back to the Russian and like translate it myself just to be like, I feel like, because in other translations this is a very funny moment. I don't think it was conveyed well in that one. I was reading the edition translated by Diana Bergen and Catherine Tiernan, and that for my money, I think that one came through very well for me. It was very funny. It captured the spirit of what I think the novel should be.
Yeah, I don't know that you're gonna get everything from the original, but you can get definitely the gist, and this one to me didn't quite get the gist. Yeah,
that's fair. Speaking of getting the gist, let's talk. Do you mind if we start with the procurator and our good friend Pontius Pilate?
Sure.
Our erstwhile hero of a sort. I don't want to overstate my case here because I hesitate in the same way that at the start of this episode, Matt pointed out rightly so that if you walk away from this being like, I think I got it, this is my understanding, and this is what the book is about, you're probably missing some things. I don't want to overstate the case here, especially in terms of reading this as a piece of dissident literature. right? Reading this specifically as like the Soviet state wouldn't let him write this, or wrote this secretly for the drawer, which is of course true. But I think that we shouldn't reduce it only to, as this is one big metaphor for, the sort of writing about the Soviet state. I think it's
definitely not. I think actually if you see anything today, for the most part, that has continued to live on as something that people recommend reading, it is because it exceeds a simple satire of the Soviet Union or a criticism of the Soviet Union, for instance, right?
Yeah.
There's something else there that's worthwhile to kind of dig out and kind of wrestle with. And this for sure is a great example of that. There's more, there's layers. Like, it's been picked up by people in so many disciplines. Everybody who doesn't study Russian literature like has had some input or take on this book. It's extremely, extremely popular for that reason, that there's just a lot there.
Yes, exactly. And so, with that caveat in mind, I think one thing I want to focus on is after Pilate Judas, after he does kill Judas at night, after he does make sure Yeshua Ha-Nozri is buried, he, at one point, I can't remember, I want to say this is the narrator almost in conversation with Pilate, where he's regretting having, Ha-Nozri's death, and the narrator says, "Excuse me, philosopher," as Pilate's thinking of how he wishes Ha-Nozri is still alive. "Could you, with your intelligence, really imagine that the procurator of Judea would ruin his career over a man who had committed a crime against Caesar? Of course he would. He would not have done it in the morning. But now, at night, having weighed everything, he would be glad to do it. He would do anything to save the totally innocent mad dreamer and physician from death." And so there's a couple layers there. One, earlier on, if you wanted to read Ha-Nozri's death, in this case, as sort of a implicit criticism of the ways that, the small crimes of the society that you might suffer for, in Ha-Nozri's case, a mere criticism of Caesar. Now, at this point, Pilate no longer believes simply speaking out as a crime at all. On one level, you could read it that way. But also on another level, I'm really interested in the place that night operates under, and not only night, but the features of night, the moon. So many of our characters literally become transformed at night. In this case, Pilate obviously goes from thinking, no, I must carry out my duty. I must have Ha-Nozri killed for this crime against Caesar. But also in a more literal sense, right? We've got Margarita and Natasha, of course, are transformed into witches at night under this full moon. And for Pilate, we are talking about the full moon here, but as Pilate's story continues, he will become enraptured by the moon. In fact, in a way, I think I might not have mentioned this in my summary.
Did you read that article on the moon?
No.
Is that what you draw this from?
No, I did. I was trying to find an article on the moon. I did not read. I had one about.
Oh, okay.
I found an article about the moon, but it was more so about the dates and less so about the moon itself. If you actually had one on the moon, I would actually like to interrogate that, because the moon was something
I didn't read it.
Okay.
I just saw one about the moon and the lunar cycles, and I thought, I wonder if I can read that one. It's funny because I'll see what you read based on the things that I was like, I don't know if I'll get to that. And then you'll talk about it and I'll be like, oh man, I should have read that one.
Man, I feel in this case we'll both have to go back and look at that one.
Probably.
Yeah, I don't know if I have like a solid, like what night is, but right, I mean, in the daytime, everything is normal, but at nighttime, that is when this sort of, the world of, I don't know, normalcy goes away, right? I mean, we literally, in a sense that we go from the normal world of Moscow to Volin telling the story, and I think it begins in Jerusalem, if not at night, at least in a darkening sky under the storm. And you have these characters who, I don't know, it's under some sort of cloak, right? You've got these people who are all stuck in feeling they have to live a certain way, and then they're given some sort of reason or some sort of excuse to break out of that. And broadly speaking, it's nighttime, but I think you could tie it to a lot more than that, right? I mean, for Margarita, obviously, we've talked about sort of the place that witchiness played, becoming a witch, all these features, these characteristics that this might imply for this transformation in terms of Pilate's. That's obviously the purest, where it's just simply the fall of night, no longer being under, I don't know, the watchful gaze of the state, of Caesar, of his own secret police, of himself. Now is able to engage with himself in an honest way. And I think that's a lot of characters in this book are not able to engage with themselves honestly. I would say that's what leads to Berlioz's death in a way. Volin kills him because he's peddling this dishonesty that Volin kind of accuses of knowing that it is. So I don't know if I have like a solid outcome here.
I don't know. I blame the Comsomol girl who spills the sunflower oil.
Yeah, well, I guess, the literal sense.
What was she doing there with all that sunflower oil?
That's just too much sunflower oil. How about that? That's too dangerous. You should have known.
Mm-hmm.
This should be against, the rules and regulations of the Comsomol.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know if I have like a solid, what does this mean? But it's interesting that this place that the night plays, and especially the moon, because Pilate, as we'll find later on when Margarita and the Master are flying away, they find Pilate still in Judea who's been sitting there for 2,000 years, staring at the moon, and Volin tells them, right? I mean, like, you never finished the story, so he's stuck here, and for thousands of years, all he's done is comment that the moon is bad tonight. The very lines that he's introduced to us by, and after so much time, the master finally finishes his story and beseeches him that he's free. He can finally go, and the city falls apart, and this night falls away, and Pilate finally follows the path up to this physician that he's been seeking after for 2,000 years, and goes up to finally go to Yeshua Ha-Nozri. And I think that's interesting that much in the same way that Margarita can forgive, she forgives Frida, the Master can forgive Pilate. And so this very central tenet of Christianity, the idea that the Christ figure is the one by this crucifixion forgives all of mankind, is not true here. In fact, there are certain people, in this case Master and Margarita, who can forgive people that no one else can forgive, or simply it's not their department to forgive. And I think that's a very interesting thing.
That's true. That's very interesting. I didn't think about night that much, but it is interesting.
Yeah. It's just so much of the story happens. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking night in terms of the story, but it just feels like so.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that's kind of the trick of the story. There was one article that I skimmed on why critics can't agree on what the story means, and I think that you bring up a good point, which is that there are certain central points of the story where they seem to connect all these different plot lines, and so critics will try to map on certain characters, certain themes, certain just things that seem to be recurrent across all of these different plot lines, and say, okay, well, this happens in this spot in these plot lines, and so we can connect them based on this, but it doesn't usually or always quite hold. They they don't quite all overlap onto each other, and for this reason there's always these sort of discrepancies that don't quite line up in sort of the vaguest of ways, and so I think that's what kind of a lot of interpretation does in the book, which is that it brings it to a certain point, but it doesn't quite reveal what it is and what it's doing, and that's what I think remains so fascinating about it. And so what I would say for this book specifically is that's kind of why I've come to the conclusion of just enjoy the book. There are some cases where scholarship and criticism can really improve your reading experience. I'm going to be honest, I really don't know if this is one of them. I don't know if there's anyone listening who's had something just so insightful and brilliant that they feel like should be shared. But I feel like this one, for this reason, that I'm not sure there's just, a handful of dominant theories that can really, be excessively applied. You know what I mean? A lot of what I'm reading is just super, super ingrained in not just Russian, but other world literatures and comparison, and just, it just strikes me as a little too much, is all. Not to be an anti-academic here, but...
No, I get it. I think what are like you say, trying to create an overarching, I guess, moral world here is difficult, right? Because you might be tempted, and maybe you could do this successfully. I'd have to see it, where for example, in this conversation between the devil and Levi Matvey, where Matvey refers to him as, evil, he calls him spirit of evil. And so they're like, okay, they've got a traditional, we've got Matvey, the representative of Christ, and the devil here. And the devil is like, well, says, what would all your good do if evil didn't exist? And what would the earth look like if all the shadows disappeared? And, Matvey calls him a sophist. And we're like, okay, so this is more of a traditional, maybe good and evil idea. But then Matvey tells the devil to take the Master and Margarita and give him peace, which is apparently, which is something that the devil here is able to do. Light is different from peace, but, peace is still a good thing, which the devil has the ability to grant. That introduces an interesting, complication of this moral system of religion, or I guess, I don't know if it's religion per se, but there's so many spanners are thrown into these consistent things that if you did the work, maybe you could create this consistent, here is the system, here is the world, here is the moral line. But I don't really know if it is there in any sense, right? I mean, at the end of the novel, Under the Moon, finally all the retinue of Voland are revealed in their true aspects. And maybe in another book, those true aspects would reveal some deeper truth about the book. But I don't know if they do here. They're interesting, right? Koroviev being a sort of a knight who told a bad joke, Behemoth being the greatest jester of his age, Azazello being just a demon killer. I mean, all these things in there, maybe in another book would have a significance, and I think they do have significance here, but I don't think that's one that ties up anything super meaningful. It is more than it is consistent, I guess.
It is really, really hard. I think this is in one way why some people have called it a post-symbolist work. Just because none of the characters, none of the anything of the book, I don't think can really be nailed down as fixed. So you might have something that works really well for a handful of instances, but someone else can read through or you could read through and find, right, well, it doesn't quite line up in this case because this character is, they're different here. A lot of the characters' essences, if you will, aren't completely fixed, especially when we're talking about these otherworldly presences. And it is a challenge, like Margarita says. It's not every day that you meet these unclean spirits.
Right.
Just some of those lines are so good. But yeah, no, that is definitely a challenge because the book brings you to the precipice of seemingly understanding perfectly what is going on. Yes, it's good and evil. Yes, it's this or that. But it doesn't quite conclude completely on that. And we'd love it to, but it probably wouldn't be the book that it is if it did.
No, I think the fact that it leaves these things up to the point of how much of this happened, right? I mean, there's a certain point in the book which basically implies that the physical bodies or some material representation of both Master and Margarita stayed in their place the whole time. That there is when Master and Margarita die, so to speak, in their apartment, which other people do interact with them with. Ivan is in his cell or in his room, and a nurse, after some cajoling, tells him that the man in 118, which is of course the Master, who's apparently still there, has died. And this happens after the Master and Margarita go visit him, and he kind of declares, oh, well, I bet across the city that there's a woman who's died at almost the same moment. And also there's an allusion to a woman in Margarita's apartment calling out for Natasha. So you've got a possible physical representation of both these two people who never left. And of course their spiritual, physical, what is it? Representation that are actually interacting with the devil that goes off. Who's to say? I don't know. It's just unresolved. And I think it doesn't matter if you resolve it or not. I don't think that it would add anything to the story if you did nail that down. It simply is.
Yeah, and so that to me is that to me is sort of in some ways. Now, I keep in mind I'm not an expert at all in anything I'm about to say. But to me, that is sort of the almost theological, if you will, significance of the novel is that these people, these characters, you can continue to go further and further into your sort of understanding of them. They're sort of infinite in that way, and the novel as they combine are sort of infinite. We can never completely grasp what it means to know these characters, which is really, really frustrating as a reader and as someone who's trying to almost systematically understand them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that is what remains frustrating to me as someone who has to come on and feel like they have to give somebody an answer about what this book is about. I don't really know. I certainly have some thoughts on it, but on one level, it is about what is sort of fundamentally unknowable to us. And the only character that seems to be all-knowing is this devil figure that we have. But even with him, he doesn't give us everything that we want to know, and that's what's, frustrating.
Even with the devil in the end, when finally the aspects of all the retinue are revealed, Margarita looks over at the devil and says, finally his true aspect is apparent now too, and then she describes his horse. We still don't know the devil. He's the most unknowable, the only character who knows it all. I mean, maybe the only two who know it all are Yeshua Ha-Nozri and the devil, and neither of them truly appear in the novel in a sense.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot that gets me thinking on this book, especially after I've had a beer, and I'm like, oh, that is quite interesting.
I do think we've got these parallel stories, and we've got. I think it's really interesting. I don't know what so much of this is I think this is interesting. I want to call attention to it, but I don't have a solid answer here for what this is. Right when they're leaving, like I mentioned before, Moscow, they leave Moscow in the same way that we join Jerusalem, and with almost the same words, except the only difference being the storm beginning. In that case, the storm begins, and that leads to us, the rest of the story in Jerusalem. And here, the storm begins, and Voland disappears. Right, these two ties between these two places, and looking at a lot of. Analysis of this. There's a lot of articles we both read and we don't bring on here because it either doesn't fit, we don't have enough time, for whatever reason it is. And so many of them do so much work to really make the parallels, try to map out all these parallels. And, I don't know, there's one article that happens to be, note on May Day, Good Friday and the full moon, and Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, which is 5 pages on. Does Devil's Ball happen on Good Friday? Right? What day does that correspond to in the Jerusalem plotline?
That's like Bulgakov's wired autocomplete interview.
Right. Yeah, there's so many people focusing on that, and I think obviously you can't discount it because that attention is drawn to it so often. But also I wonder if that overtakes a lot of other meanings in a way. That just trying to be where are the lines, where are the direct comparisons here, what do they mean, might almost overshadow a lot of the other things being conveyed in the novel. And I do want to jump from there into talking about Yvonne. I don't know, that's kind of going to be its own tangent. Is there anything while we're still here, you want to address before I take us off in a different direction?
Just on the very briefly on the inability to completely pin down the everything. So I think that Bulgakov definitely is. We know for a fact that this is a satire of the Soviet system, but I think that what goes over people's heads when they read it now is how the Soviet system, a lot of the underlying bases of it, weren't necessarily that far off from a lot of the underlying bases of how we also think. It wasn't that different, some of it. This over-reliance on a sort of materialist understanding of our own world, and I think what Bulgakov is posing is right, the idea that there could be, it seems likely based on his book, right, that he thought that there was more to it. And so poking fun at people who have this sort of over-reliance on, especially looking at the epilogue, a materialist understanding, well, it was all mass psychosis, or psychology tells us that it was this or that. Our kind of knee-jerk reaction to prescribe what it was, because the idea that something isn't completely fathomable to us is so uncomfortable to sit with. And it's uncomfortable even thinking about it as talking about it on the podcast, because I want to know what he was on about, right? But this goes to our own understanding of how we see the world today, right? That's why I think it continues to be more than just a simple satire, because it does kind of it pokes fun at a really dominant strand of thinking in the last lot of years, I would say. And I think that's why it remains just, of course it's funny, but it also is challenging for us to read now, where we want to kind of break down and understand everything exactly as it is. And Bulgakov says, no, you don't get to do that. You do not get to do that. And so that's what I think remains kind of interesting about it. and challenging. And maybe you don't agree with me. That's fine. You're 42 minutes into the episode. I've already won.
Right. No, I think that's a good point, because even this world of like what has happened is also, it's even the very basis of the story itself is continually subverted, right? I mean, we've already mentioned, the physical potentially forms of Master and Margarita, but also at the very end, in like the last 2 or 3 pages, Ivan Bezdomny, or just simply Ivan at this point, Professor Ivan, I forget his last name, is like every year he has this dream we mentioned, and in this dream he happens to see what is alluded to or insinuated by the text to be Yeshua Ha-Nozri and Pontius Pilate walking forever every year with his dog. And, in this, the ending, you've got like, Pilate saying, "Oh, what a vulgar execution that was. Tell me it didn't really happen." And, the Yeshua says, "Oh, of course it didn't." And Pilate says, "You swear to that?" And Yeshua says, "Yeah, of course." And, you could read that as simply a sort of a conversation between companions, friends, what have you, but also in literal sense, this story is also telling you this very basic part of this own novel. I don't think it's actually telling you this didn't happen, but like calling doubt to it, I think, is the bigger point, right? Even if the doubt is not for you, the reader, even if the doubt is for the characters themselves, the basic plot points are doubted by one or another, or at least denied, right? The very basis of this world is not, even if it is only in the minds of those who live it, is not standard. It's not consistent.
Yeah, that is an interesting point.
But speaking of that, do you mind if we talk about Ivan, our friend Ivanushka?
I know you want to go to Ivan, and I'm curious to hear what you have on Ivan here. What's your dirt on Ivan?
When I'm going to open up the file we have on Mr.
What did you dig up from his MySpace profile that was so embarrassing on Ivan?
We talked about Ivan briefly. I want to say it was episode 1 on sort of like the this diagnosis of schizophrenia he gets, and saying that perhaps this schizophrenia diagnosis reflects that he's not able to see between what they see as reality and fiction, but in fact he is one of the 2 people who can see that reality coincides with a hyper reality. In this this article I read, The Master and Margarita's Creative Process by Pierre Hart, is really interesting because it has, I don't know if I fully buy the idea of Ivan as like a metaphor for creative process. I think this gets to the same idea of what Matt was talking about earlier, with there's a tendency to take one element and say this through line tells you what the novel is all about, or at least really what we're supposed to take away, one of the big ones. And so I'm not going to oversell at this point. But I do think the analysis of Ivan's evolution through the novel is super interesting, because we begin the novel on Ivan and we end the novel on Ivan. And I would submit to you that I think there's like 3 main plot lines, of course, through Master and Margarita, 3 stories of relationships. There's the story of the relationship, obviously, between the devil and Margarita, as the devil coming to Moscow and causing chaos. There's the story of the relationship between Pilate and Yeshua Ha-Nozri. And finally, there's the relationship between the Master and and Margarita. However, I think there's also a 4th one, which is the relationship between Master and Ivan. As the Master's relation, as Ivan experiences the devil, and then in reaction to the Master's kind of pushing and prodding in those situations, he grows to be someone entirely different, and someone that is in his own way tied into the narrative in a way that other characters aren't, right? We begin on Ivan Bezdomny, sort of this Ivan the poet, who has submitted a piece about Jesus Christ, but in this version, Jesus Christ is real, but he's saying, look, Jesus Christ was a flawed human like everyone else. And, of course, Berlioz says, no, that we need you to say that Jesus doesn't exist. That's what we're here for, right? He is, Bezdomny is writing officially sanctioned art. And then, of course, the Volan comes and all the rest happens. And Bezdomny is a little bit more receptive, right, to like what's going on there. And he's a little bit more willing to believe these fantastical elements, which does lead him to being institutionalized. I think an interesting point that Hart points out is that kind of very early on, after when Bezdomny is trying to like track down Voland in the immediate aftermath of the murder, he shows up at Gurubiedov's that night wearing a white robe with with an icon pinned to his breast. It's he was barefoot and wearing a whitish belted blouse. On his chest, a paper icon with the picture of an unknown saint fastened with the safety pin. In his hand, Ivan Nikolaevich carried a lighted candle. He's like, he, of course, everyone there thinks he's gone mad, but he almost takes on this idea of like this kind of holy fool, which you might be familiar, it's trope you might be familiar with, of this person who, by lacking rationality, is in fact closer to God. And as he is institutionalized, he, of course, is interacting with the master, and the master tells him, "You don't have very good poetry," and Ivan says, "Yeah, I know. I'm planning to stop writing it." And interestingly, he stops being called Ivan Bezdomny relatively early on, and he becomes Ivan, Ivanushka, and finally at the end of the novel, he's Professor Ivan Nikolaevich. And so he's like growing, and I think the key point here is at the very end of the novel, when finally the master makes his last visit to Ivan. The master refers to Ivan as his disciple and basically tells him, "Look, I understand that you've wanted to stop writing, and you have a greater project in mind, so it's up to you to write the epilogue, to write the sequel to what I've written, to my piece, right? What comes next after that?" And Ivan kind of says, "Okay, sure." And so what we begin on is Ivan Bezdomny, the party hack, writing like Jesus was a human person and is subject to like human flaws, ends up being kind of the main point of the novel, which is Yeshua Ha-Nozri, whatever the, apparently has some sense of divinity here, but also this Yeshua Ha-Nozri claims humanity much more fully than I think you could say the Christ of the Bible does. And Ivan ends up being right, and he ends up being the disciple of the master to carry on that work. And of course, he doesn't actually do that. But every year, once a year, that connection still carries on, and that connection to this story is deep, right? Because I think I want to say there are only 3 or 4 characters from whose perspective we jump from Moscow to Jerusalem. First, obviously, the devil who starts telling the story of Jerusalem. Then there's Margarita, who begins reading, and that jumps into Jerusalem. And I want to say there's one other one, I forget one. I think it's Master. It is either the Master or Margarita, or perhaps from a scene where they're all there. But Ivan Bezdomny, or Ivan, who has at this point been institutionalized, is the only other character who has that reaction. And instead of either being there and telling the story or reading about the story, he has it naturally. He is simply sitting in the asylum. He has had, I think, a sedative, and he's staring out the window, and what he sees out there transitions into Jerusalem. He has a very natural relationship to this story. And from this is where, of course, Hart begins arguing that this is sort of a metaphor of sorts, an extended metaphor for the creative process, right? Which I don't know if I fully, buy that in particular, but I think it is an interesting point to make, and it's something that I'm like really following as I go along. I think at one point, it's, of course, the end. The master is not the end all be all of this creative process. It's not so much about the person as it is about the project itself. And Hart writes, elimination of the master from further artistic involvement leaves unanswered the question posed by Voland: who then will be writing? Whereas where the individual artist may concede defeat, the Master and Margarita itself, as a literary artifact, attests to the ongoing nature of the artistic process. The Master and Margarita itself, of course, not being its own first attempt or first pass at that. So I think that's an interesting way of viewing it. Like I said, I don't know if I fully buy it, but Ivan, I think should be considered a 4th major plotline in the book in its own way. This relationship, this evolution of party hack to apparently respected professor by this involvement in it, and this very natural engagement with the themes that everyone else either lived through or has to read in a way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do think that the point on artistic creation is something that is pretty prevalent and important. Just the actual, like, I just because of the way that the work is actually constructed, the amount of layers of who is actually telling what and what is actually happening, which is something that you can normally take for granted, I think, in a novel.
Right.
Is so just kind of morphed in this situation. And it's so interesting just the way that you're not sure what is, I don't know how to say, like, what is written, what is artificial construction, and what is life, right? The border between these two is very blurred. And there is, the more I read this, the more I'm like, okay, every person is sort of its own level before it even reaches us as the reader. And then as it's, continues to be filtered through us, that relationship further deepens, I guess, and it becomes even more challenging. And I think that's again what makes it difficult to come to one definite conclusion. And even just like some of the points that you mentioned, like the way that people are called, that they're named throughout the book, changes so much, and I've seen that point made in several different articles. Well, okay, they're called this here, but they're called that over there, and people will really read into this. I think that what you were saying was totally valid in that sense, but I've seen some cases where I'm like, okay, maybe a little bit
Right.
much there, I don't know. But again, it's just a testament to the construction of the novel and, what it is overall, that people can continue to just find more and more and more to read into. But it does make me sometimes feel on this, like, as we've been doing a lot of Nabokov this year, like this sort of referential mania in some ways is what I feel like I'm doing with this.
I had that exact point of reference as you were going through that. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me kind of feel like, have a laugh. The cat gets, the cat's glocking people. The cat's getting glocked. No one's getting hurt. Everyone's having a PG fun, an American PG fun time. A fun time. And there's a Devil's Ball, which may or may not be on Good Friday. So it makes me feel like, it's funny, it's an enjoyable read, it's provocative in a lot of ways, and that it should be left at that and not necessarily just, beat to death.
I think that's a good way of posing it. I think we should perhaps take from the example of the Master and Margarita, who a master for years or obsessing over this text, turning himself into an asylum over it, finally lets go. And he actually, I maybe should have focused on this before, ends up burning the manuscript along with everything else. He says, well, I don't need it. It's in my mind now. And with that sort of gentle relationship and finally finishing it and speaking the word into life, he and Margarita go to their simple, eternal life of not happiness. I mean, not necessarily like light, not necessarily goodness, badness, but simply of peace, letting it be as is. Maybe there's a lesson there.
Maybe, or maybe not, and you can keep reading into it. That's fine.
Or maybe you could just keep analyzing the symbolism all the way down to the end.
You know what? As long as you're having fun, that's what's important to me.
I think maybe that's really what this book is all about. Just have a good time.
Mm-hmm. Just have a good time. Have a Devil's Ball.
Attend in, whatever attire you will. Go swimming in the champagne. Just enjoy yourself.
Just enjoy yourself.
That's all I had to talk about. Is there anything you want to address while we're here before we close out?
No, just thank you to everyone who read along with us, and I hope that this was fulfilling and interesting. And if you still have remaining questions, to join our Discord to talk about it with us, because I know as many of you who are listening as this comes out may have questions, but those of you who are listening years and years and years in the future hopefully will still be here to answer your questions before we likewise I would assume get sent up with the Master and Margarita to our own piece, which is where all of podcasters will go, just on a sort of a separate plane, so that we stop our annoyance.
Well, that's actually one of the contracts of becoming a podcaster, is that you can neither go to heaven nor hell. You get sent somewhere else.
It's a podcasting purgatory, yeah.
Okay, well, oh my God. I think this is, we didn't really mention this. I don't think we want to make a big deal out of it, but this, I think, is, if we've done our math right, our 100th episode.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Released just before, just a week before, I think, our 3-year anniversary. So
it's kind of our 100th episode. If you don't count in some of the bonuses that we factored, that we did or did not factor, it's the 100th one that we have numbered in our Google Drive.
Yes. According to our math, it is the 100th episode. I'm going to put a big asterisk there and then just leave it like that.
Yes.
Happy birthday to Slavic Lit Pod. Just want to point that out before we leave.
Happy, centennial episode.
Yeah. Happy probable centennial.
We kind of did it.
Right. We probably did it a while back, but that was probably a much less momentous episode. So at least we finished them.
Most likely.
Right. Well, that's all I wanted to say on that. Didn't want to make too big of a deal of it, but hey, there it is. That's cool. But before we completely wrap up, Matt, I got to ask, well, I guess I can't ask what we're tackling next week, but what is coming up next for us?
Oh, that is real sad. Yeah, next week, nothing's coming up. That is sad. Next month, nothing is also coming up for us. A big old fat nothing. We are on our December break next month, but you will be hearing a little bit more from us. I will leave that in complete suspense until you until you do that hearing. But we will not be having any numbered episodes. We have a couple of things that will be coming up, just kind of to keep your eyes and or ears peeled for. If you are not already aware, we're doing our Chapter a Day Life and Fate read-along coming in 2024. We have so much work that has already gone and will be going into that. So if that's a book that you have ever wanted to read or sounds at all interesting to you, I really recommend that you hop on the chance to read it along with us this year, because it might not be a book that we do this for again. We have a lot of books that we're interested in exploring, so this might not happen again. So get on it while you can. Other than that, I would say that, we'll see you in January of 2024.
See you in the new year.
I mean, I'll be clowning around on social media because that's what I do. But
right.
Other than that, I'll see you in January.
Yeah, well, if you're on our Discord, you'll still see us, but it's a little incentive for you.
I'm relentless there.
Yeah.
Can't get away from it.
Right.
Anyways, for all of you who are helping to keep our show independent, we so appreciate it. And if you are interested in helping support this podcast, which is such a labor of love, go on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. You'll get notes, you'll get quotes, you'll get lots of stuff. We put a lot of work into designing our tiers. If you really don't care about the tiers, you're just happy that this show exists, you can also support us at slaviclitpod.com. And before we let you go, we want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current supporters.
Yes, and those are Mickey and or Mikey. Let me know what the pronunciation is. Eric, Peter, Eric again, this time with a K, Ben, Jeff, Mai, Daniel, Lou, Gary, Janice, Anne, Isaac, Emily, Caitlin, Yitza, Irini, and Packrob. And the music used in this episode was Staraya Kino by Peremotka. You can find more of their stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify. The links and spelling are in the show notes.
You'll hear from us again in year 4.